History teaches us that love requires sacrifice. But for Princess Maria of Greece, it was the lack of love that saved her life. Sometimes a miserable marriage is the ultimate life insurance policy. Forced to wed into the Romanov dynasty, the wealthiest family on earth, Maria rejected everything about her new life. She hated Russia. She loathed the court. And she abandoned her husband, finding every excuse to live a separate life in the safety of England. Society called her spoiled. Her family called her cold. But that very heartlessness was the only thing that shielded her from the apocalypse. When the Russian Revolution turned the palaces into slaughterhouses, her devoted, patriotic husband stayed at his post and was brutally executed against a fortress wall. And Maria? She survived simply because she was busy, hiding from him. Maria lived. George didn't. And that gap is where everything begins. Start in Athens, not Russia. That's where her instincts were shaped. The crime scene was Europe, specifically the suffocating, incestuous, glittering world of Victorian royalty at the turn of the century. We often look back at this era through a lens of nostalgia. We see the tiaras, the balls at the Winter Palace, the yachts cruising the Mediterranean. But strip away the gold leaf and you find a brutal commodities market. The commodities were not oil or steel, but human beings, specifically royal daughters. Maria was born into this marketplace in 1876. She was the daughter of King George I of Greece and Grand Duchess Olga Konstantinovna of Russia. On paper, she was royalty of the highest order, but in reality, the Greek royal family was an anomaly. They were the poor relations of Europe. Maria grew up in Athens, and this is a crucial psychological detail often overlooked by historians. Her childhood was not defined by the rigid protocol of the North. It was defined by the Mediterranean sun, by a certain informality, by a sense of freedom. She was wilder than her northern cousins. She was accustomed to a court that felt more like a large, boisterous family home than a state institution. This upbringing created a specific psychological profile. Maria had a low tolerance for artifice. She craved authenticity. She craved air. But in the year 1900, a princess's craving for air was irrelevant. The only thing that mattered was the alliance. And the greatest alliance of all, the prize every king wanted for his daughter, was Russia. The Romanovs were not just rich, they were theoretically wealthy. They possessed a kind of wealth that distorts reality. To marry a Romanov was to enter a world where money had no meaning because there was no limit to it. But it was also to enter a world of medieval paranoia, heavy religiosity, and crushing boredom. Maria was 24 years old, dangerously old for an unmarried princess of that era, when the trap snapped shut. The proposal came from Grand Duke George Mikhailovich of Russia. George matters here because he didn't change. Grand Duke George was a cousin of the Tsar. He was a good man. By all accounts, he was gentle, pious, and utterly devoted to his family. But in the theater of history, good does not always mean right. George had a fatal flaw, a distinct lack of imagination. He was a man of routine. His great passion in life was not art or war or politics or even romance. It was numismatics. He was a coin collector. He could spend hours staring at pieces of metal, cataloging them, obsessing over their minute details. Do you see the tragedy forming? It wasn't a collision of fire and ice. It was a collision of wind and stone. Maria was the wind, restless, moving, needing to flow. George was the stone, solid, immovable, and to Maria suffocatingly heavy. She did not want to marry him. She fought it. But the pressure from her father, King George I, was absolute. The Greek throne needed the Russian alliance. The family needed the financial security. Maria was the currency used to purchase that security. She accepted the proposal, but she did not accept the life. The wedding took place in 1900. Immediately, the mechanism of estrangement began to turn. It started slowly, a quiet grinding of gears that would eventually tear the marriage apart. Maria moved to Russia, and the culture shock was physical. She detested the climate. The long, dark winters of St. Petersburg depressed her. She found the Russian aristocracy to be hypocritical and overly formal. Every conversation was a minefield of protocol. Every dinner was a theatrical performance she hadn't rehearsed for. But more than the country, she detested the intimacy of the marriage. George adored her, and in a cruel twist of psychology, his adoration only made her recoil further. There is nothing more suffocating than the unrequited love of a boring person. He wanted to possess her attention. She wanted to flee. He wanted to discuss the stability of the ruble. She wanted to be back in Athens, swimming in the Aegean. She gave him 2 daughters, Princess Nina and Princess Xenia. She did her biological duty, and then she stopped doing her emotional duty. This is where the life-saving estrangement begins to take shape. It wasn't a single decision to leave. It was a gradual erosion of presence. Maria began to find excuses. The classic weapon of the unhappy aristocratic wife was health. The spas of Germany, the fresh air of France, the healing waters of Harrogate in England. She claimed her constitution could not handle the Russian winter. She claimed her daughters needed better air. Society rolled its eyes. Everyone knew what health reasons meant. It meant she couldn't stand her husband. By 1914, the pattern was set. Maria was essentially living a separate life. She had established a household in England. She was raising her daughters as English women, not Russians. She was spending George's money, vast sums of it, while denying him her company. George remained in Russia. He wrote to her constantly. His letters from this period are heartbreaking artifacts. He does not scold her. He does not demand she return. He pleads. He tells her about the weather, about his coins, about his loneliness. He sends checks. He is the ultimate enabler of his own abandonment. We must stop and judge this moment not with modern eyes, but with the eyes of 1914. To her contemporaries, Maria was a villain. She was a bad wife. She was taking the Romanov gold but refusing the Romanov burden. In the court of public opinion, she was guilty of selfishness and desertion. And she was selfish. There is no denying that. She placed her own happiness above her vows. But here is the question that haunts this narrative. Is selfishness a survival trait? If Maria had been a good wife, if she had been dutiful, loyal, and submissive, she would have been in St. Petersburg in 1917. She would have been standing next to George when the world collapsed. Her virtue would have been her death sentence. Instead, her vice, her coldness, her refusal to submit to a life she hated was about to become her shield. Summer 1914. The world holds its breath. The Great War begins. At this precise moment, Maria was in England with her daughters. George was in Russia. The borders began to close. The iron curtain of war descended across the continent. Maria made a gesture. We must give her credit for this. She attempted to return to Russia. She packed her trunks. She prepared to join her husband, to serve as a Red Cross nurse, to do her duty as a Grand Duchess in wartime. But the route was blocked. Germany was now the enemy. The path to Russia was dangerous. She turned back. Psychologically, this is the pivot point. A more determined woman, a woman in love, might have found a way. other royals did. They traveled through Scandinavia, they took risks. But Maria? She accepted the blockage with a resignation that looked suspiciously like relief. She returned to Harrogate, to the tea rooms, to the safety of the English countryside. The physical separation was now absolute. The war provided the ultimate alibi. She couldn't go back. It wasn't that she didn't want to. The war prevented it. The mechanism of estrangement had evolved from a personal choice into a geopolitical reality. While George watched the Russian army disintegrate, while he watched the morale of his country collapse, Maria watched the rain fall in England. She was safe, but her safety was built on a foundation of unresolved conflict. She was a Grand Duchess without a duchy, a wife without a husband. She did not know it yet, but the clock was ticking. The Romanov dynasty had 3 years left to live, and because she was a bad wife, because she was the woman who ran away, she was standing outside the blast zone. But the blast was coming, and it would destroy everything she hated and the one man who loved her. The Great War did not just redraw the maps of Europe, it redrew the emotional landscape of Maria's marriage. As the guns began to hammer on the western and eastern fronts, a profound and terrifying silence descended between the husband in Russia and the wife in England. It was not a silence of lost connection, for letters still flowed back and forth, dodging U-boats and censors. It was a silence of experience. They were inhabiting 2 different planets. In Russia, Grand Duke George Mikhailovich did what he had always done, his duty. He reined in his passion for numismatics and put on his uniform. He was appointed a general, attached to the headquarters of the commander-in-chief. We must understand the psychology of this man to understand his eventual fate. George was a true believer. He believed in God, he believed in the Tsar, and he believed in Russia. When the war began badly, when the Russian army, poorly equipped and poorly led, began to suffer staggering losses, George did not waver. His letters to Maria during this period are studies in Stoicism. He wrote from military trains and muddy encampments near the front lines. He described the horrors of modern warfare, the gas, the artillery that turned men into mist, the endless freezing misery of the common soldier. Yet his tone remained resolute. He was a Romanov. Suffering was part of the divine mandate. And where was Maria while her husband watched his world beginning to bleed to death? She was in Harrogate, North Yorkshire. Harrogate was a spa town, famous for its restorative waters and polite society. It was quiet, orderly, and desperately safe. While George's ears rang with artillery fire, Maria's days were marked by the sound of rain on window panes and polite conversation over tea. She was not entirely idle. She sponsored hospitals for wounded officers. She managed her daughter's education. She lived the life of a respectable, wealthy exile, but the contrast is nauseating. She was living on the money George sent her from a country that was rapidly bankrupting itself. She was safe under the protection of the British king, her cousin, while her husband's cousin Tsar Nicholas II was leading his dynasty off a cliff. This period from 1914 to 1916 solidified the mechanism that would define the rest of her life. The physical distance she had cultivated out of boredom and dislike had hardened into a geopolitical reality. The English Channel was no longer just a body of water. It was a moat protecting her from the consequences of being a Romanov. Back in St. Petersburg, soon renamed Petrograd to sound less German, the rot was setting in. The war was a catastrophe. The economy collapsed. Food shortages began to gnaw at the populace. In the palaces, the atmosphere turned toxic. The influence of the mystic Rasputin on the Empress Alexandra drove a wedge between the throne and the nobility. George saw it all. He was at the center of the storm. He saw the incompetence of the military leadership. He felt the rising hatred in the streets. He was a good man trapped in a collapsing system, but his fatal weakness, his unimaginative loyalty, blinded him to the inevitable. He could not conceive of a Russia without the Tsar. Maria, from her distant vantage point in England, perhaps saw things more clearly, or perhaps she simply didn't care enough to be blinded by loyalty. She read the British newspapers, which reported on the Russian chaos with a mixture of alarm and condescension. Did she feel guilt during these years? It is hard to say. Her letters to George were affectionate, but distant. She complained of the damp English weather while he was freezing on the Eastern Front. It was a profound emotional disconnect. She was a passenger on a lifeboat, complaining about the seasickness while watching the Titanic sink with her husband on deck. Then came 1917, the year zero. In February, the dam broke. The bread riots in Petrograd turned into a revolution. The army mutinied. The centuries-old edifice of Romanov power crumbled in a matter of days. Tsar Nicholas II abdicated. Overnight, the most powerful dynasty on earth became pariahs in their own land. Consider where our two protagonists were at this precise world-shattering moment. George Mikhailovich was in Petrograd. When the news of the abdication hit, he was devastated. His entire belief system, the divine right of kings, the sacred duty of his family to rule, evaporated. But here is the crucial point. He stayed. Why did he stay? He had money abroad. He had connections. He could have tried to flee in the chaotic early days of the provisional government. He stayed because he was a patriot. He stayed because he could not imagine abandoning his homeland in its darkest hour. He stayed because he was a good Romanov. And Maria? The news reached her in England. The Tsar had fallen. Her husband was no longer a Grand Duke in power, but a private citizen in a country exploding into anarchy. The infinite wealth was gone. The titles were meaningless. The trap had snapped shut, and Maria was standing outside of it. This is the pivotal realization of our narrative. If Maria had been a dutiful wife, if she had overcome her distaste for Russia and returned in 1914, she would have been trapped in Petrograd with George and their daughters. They would all have been at the mercy of the mob. But because she was selfish, because she had prioritized her own comfort and her distaste for her husband over her duty, she was free. The revolution had come for the Romanovs. It came with bayonets and fury, intending to wipe them off the face of the earth. But when it reached out to grab the wife of Grand Duke George Mikhailovich, its hand closed on empty air. She was already gone. She had been gone for years. The mechanism of estrangement had successfully completed its first and most vital function. It had physically removed the target from the kill zone, but survival is not the same as freedom. While Maria was physically safe, a new kind of trap was forming around her, a psychological trap built of guilt, impotence, and the terrifying knowledge that the man she had abandoned was now facing the consequences alone. The curtain had fallen on the Russian Empire. Now the tragedy of the individuals began. The spring of 1917 offered a cruel illusion of hope, a brief twilight before the total darkness fell. For a few agonizing months, it seemed as though Grand Duke George might be allowed to leave Russia, to become a simple exile, joining his family in England. He actually applied for permission to depart, desperate to see his wife and daughters. But history is often written in the ink of bureaucratic betrayals. The British government, fearing that hosting the deposed Romanovs would incite their own labor unions, quietly closed the door. The irony was suffocating. Maria was already safely behind the British gates, protected by her years of selfish absence, while her husband was locked out by the very nation sheltering his wife. He was trapped not just by the Bolsheviks, but by the geopolitics of a world that had decided the Romanovs were expendable. When the Bolsheviks seized total control in October, the time for negotiation ended and the time for terror began. The new regime did not see George as a man, but as a living symbol of centuries of oppression, a symbol that needed to be erased. He was arrested and exiled first to the bleak provincial town of Vologda, and later, as the paranoia of the regime deepened, he was dragged back to Petrograd and thrown into the Spalarnaya prison. We must confront the physical reality of this degradation to truly understand the magnitude of Maria's accidental salvation. This was a man who had lived in palaces where the floors were inlaid with rare woods and the air was scented with expensive perfumes. Now he was confined to a damp, freezing cell infested with lice, surviving on starvation rations of watery soup and rotting bread. Yet the accounts from his fellow prisoners describe a man of unbreakable, almost maddening dignity. He did not rage against his captors. He prayed. He cleaned his cell, and he maintained the quiet discipline of a Grand Duke, even as his world was reduced to 4 stone walls. Meanwhile, across the sea in Harrogate, the Great War ended, but a new, more terrifying silence descended upon Maria. The flow of letters, once constant, became erratic and then stopped almost entirely. Rumors drifted across the continent like poisonous smoke, stories of mass executions, of the Tsar's murder in a cellar in Ekaterinburg, of bodies thrown down mine shafts. Maria was living in a suspended state of widowhood, married to a ghost who might still be breathing. The estrangement that had once been a source of social embarrassment was now the only thing keeping her and her daughters alive. Every day she spent walking in the safety of an English garden was a day purchased by her refusal to be a good wife. If she had been loyal, if she had returned during the brief window of opportunity, she would be sharing that lice-ridden cell or lying in a mass grave. Her dislike for her husband, her bad attitude, had become her armor. She was safe, warm, and alive, while the man who loved her watched the winter light fade through the bars of a Bolshevik dungeon, waiting for a trial that everyone knew would never come. The winter of 1919 in Petrograd was not merely a season, it was a weapon. The city, once the jewel of the Russian Empire, had been stripped of its vanity, leaving behind a skeletal ruin of starving citizens, frozen canals, and the pervasive metallic scent of fear. Inside the Peter and Paul fortress, the stone walls seemed to hold a cold that was older than the revolution itself, a damp chill that settled into the marrow of the prisoners' bones. It was here, in the Trubetskoy bastion, that the final act of Grand Duke George Mikhailovich's life began to play out, a tragedy of duty that stood in stark, blinding contrast to the tragedy of evasion that was unfolding in the safety of England. To fully grasp the weight of this moment, we must look at the company George kept in those final days. He was not alone. He was imprisoned with his brother Grand Duke Nicholas Mikhailovich, a brilliant historian and liberal thinker who had once naively believed the revolution might improve Russia, Grand Duke Paul Alexandrovich, the uncle of the last Tsar, who was so ill he could barely stand, and Grand Duke Dmitry Konstantinovich, a deeply religious man who had spent his life in quiet service. They were the 4 Grand Dukes, a collective symbol of the old world that the Bolsheviks were determined to excise. George, true to his nature, became the anchor of the group. His fatal weakness, that unimaginative, rock-solid steadiness that had so bored His wife became a source of immense strength in the face of death. While others raged against their fate or collapsed into despair, George maintained a routine of prayer and correspondence. He was a man who had spent his life organizing coins, finding order in small metal discs. Now, in the chaos of the Red Terror, he applied that same discipline to his own soul. He cleaned his cell. He comforted his more volatile brother. He prepared himself not for liberation, but for judgment. But outside the prison walls, a frantic, disjointed effort was being made to save them. Maxim Gorky, the famous writer and a man with some influence over Lenin, was petitioned. There were moments of agonizing hope where it seemed the order for their release was signed, only to be rescinded by the paranoia of the Cheka. And where was Maria in this frantic diplomatic dance? She was paralyzed by the very distance she had cultivated. The estrangement that protected her body rendered her influence non-existent. She was a ghost in England, unable to pull any strings, unable to offer any bribe. The safe haven of Harrogate had become a padded cell of its own, where the only torture was the imagination of what was happening in Petrograd. The end came in the early hours of January 28, 1919. The pretext for the execution was a retaliation for the murders of socialist leaders Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht in Germany, a brutal logic of an eye for an eye applied to men who had nothing to do with German politics. The guards came for them in the dead of night. They were told they were being moved to another prison, the standard lie of the executioner to keep the victims compliant. George likely knew the truth. He had watched the system dismantle his world piece by piece. He understood the trajectory of the bullet. He gathered his few belongings. He prayed. The scene of the execution is one of the most haunting tableaux in 20th century history. The four Grand Dukes were led out into the courtyard of the fortress. It was bitterly cold, the kind of cold that burns the lungs. Grand Duke Paul, too sick to walk, was carried on a stretcher. Nicholas Mikhailovich, ever the intellectual eccentric, carried his favorite cat. George walked with the quiet dignity of a soldier going to a losing battle. They were lined up against the bastion wall, overlooking the frozen Neva River. A common grave had already been dug, a gaping mouth in the snow, waiting to swallow the last remnants of the Romanov dynasty. The firing squad was a mixture of soldiers and workers, men who had been taught that the figures standing before them were not human beings, but monsters who ate the bread of the poor. When the command was given, the noise was deafening in the enclosed courtyard. The good husband, the man who had written thousands of letters to a wife who wouldn't live with him, the man who had sent money he didn't have to support a lifestyle he couldn't share, fell into the snow. He died as he lived, dutifully, quietly, and without the woman who was supposed to be by his side. But the physical death of George Mikhailovich is not the climax of our story. The true psychological climax arrived weeks later in the form of a letter that made its way across the torn and bleeding continent of Europe, through the blockade, across the English Channel, and into the manicured hands of Princess Maria. The mechanism of estrangement had worked perfectly. Maria was alive. She was drinking tea. She was reading books. She was watching her daughters grow up. The biological imperative of survival had been satisfied, but now she had to pay the price for that survival. The letter George wrote before his death was not a manifesto of anger. It was not a list of grievances. A lesser man might have used his final moments to inflict pain, to lash out at the wife who had abandoned him to face the firing squad alone. He could have written, "I am dying because I stayed and you are living because you ran. He could have cursed her selfishness. Instead, George's fatal weakness, his unyielding, unconditional loyalty, manifested one last time. He wrote of his love. He wrote of his forgiveness. He wrote that he held no bitterness in his heart, only a profound sadness that he would not see her again. He entrusted their daughters to her care and prayed for her happiness. This letter was a devastating weapon. If George had died hating her, Maria could have justified her life. She could have told herself that he was a difficult man, that their marriage was a mistake, that she was right to leave. His anger would have allowed her to build a fortress of self-righteousness. But his love, his forgiveness, it stripped her naked. It denied her the role of the victim. It forced her to confront the brutal reality. She was the villain of the story who had been saved, while the hero had been slaughtered. The bad wife had won the lottery of life, and the good husband had paid for the ticket. For the rest of her life, this knowledge sat in the center of Maria's existence like a stone that could not be swallowed. She remained in England for a time, then moved back to Greece and later to Italy. She carried the title of Grand Duchess, but it was a hollow crown. The Romanov name was now a tombstone, not a credential. She eventually remarried to a Greek admiral named Pericles Ioannidis. To the casual observer, this might have looked like a happy ending, a woman moving on from tragedy. But look closer at the choices. She chose a man who was, in many ways, the opposite of George, a fellow Greek, a man of the sea, a man who belonged to her original world, the world she had tried to cling to even while married to George. It was an attempt to reset the clock, to pretend that the Russian interlude had never happened. But one cannot divorce a martyr. George's ghost was not one that haunted with chains and wailing. He haunted her with the unbearable weight of his own goodness. Every time she looked at her daughters, Nina and Xenia, she saw his face. Every time she spent a sovereign or a drachma, she knew it was a life bought with the blood of a man who had stayed when she had run. The fatal weakness of George Mikhailovich, his inability to adapt, his rigid adherence to duty and tradition, had killed him. But Maria's fatal weakness, her inability to sacrifice her own comfort for duty, her emotional coldness, had saved her. It is a conclusion that sits uncomfortably in the stomach. We are taught that virtue is rewarded and vice is punished. The story of Maria and George proves that history has no such moral compass. In the chaos of revolution, the selfish survive because they are willing to cut the ropes that bind them to the sinking ship. The loyal drown because they refuse to let go. In her later years, Maria became a somewhat eccentric figure. She wrote memoirs, she traveled, she played the role of the exiled royal. But there was always a shadow behind her eyes, a defensiveness in her demeanor. She spent decades trying to justify her life, trying to explain why she wasn't there. But the explanation was simple, and she knew it. She survived because she didn't care enough to die. As she aged, the world moved on. The Soviet Union cemented its power, the memory of the Grand Dukes fading into the footnotes of history books. But for Maria, the winter of 1919 never truly ended. She lived in the warmth of the Mediterranean and the comfort of Western Europe, but part of her remained frozen in that courtyard in Petrograd, standing next to the husband she wasn't there to hold. Her death in 1940 closed the book on a life that was a masterpiece of accidental survival. She had escaped the Bolsheviks, but she had not escaped herself. Her story remains a chilling testament to the complexity of the human heart and the arbitrary nature of fate. It forces us to ask a question we prefer to avoid. If the price of survival is the abandonment of those we are sworn to love, Will we have the courage to stay or the wisdom to run? Maria ran. And because she ran, she lived to tell a story that she could never truly make peace with. The silence that followed the execution of the Grand Dukes in 1919 was not a peaceful silence. It was a vacuum. For Maria, safe in the damp, manicured isolation of Harrogate, the world had not ended, but it had fundamentally altered its texture. She was no longer a wife avoiding a husband. She was a widow avoiding a ghost. The legal bonds that had tied her to the Romanov dynasty were severed by bullets, yet the psychological chains were suddenly made of unbreakable iron. We must now examine the aftermath of salvation, a period often glossed over in biographies, but crucial to understanding the anatomy of survivors' guilt. In the early 1920s, Europe was filled with Russian émigrés, dukes driving taxis in Paris, countesses sewing lace in London. They were a community united by loss and defined by their trauma. But Maria stood slightly apart from this collective mourning. While others wept for the husbands and fathers they had tried desperately to save, Maria had to reconcile the fact that she was alive precisely because she had spent a decade trying to get away from hers. The societal judgment was subtle but pervasive. In the drawing rooms of London, where the exiled nobility gathered to drink tea and remember a vanished world, Maria was treated with the deference due a Grand Duchess, but there was a coolness in the air. Everyone knew the story. Everyone knew that George had spent his final years pining for a wife who preferred the spas of Germany to his company. She was the woman who had abandoned the martyr. This social stigma created a new kind of prison. She had escaped the physical walls of the Peter and Paul fortress, only to build a psychological fortress around herself to keep the judgment out. Her financial situation also shifted dramatically, forcing a confrontation with reality she had long avoided. George was the source of the river of gold that had sustained her independent lifestyle. Even from prison, he had tried to ensure she was provided for. Now, that river had run dry. The Bolsheviks had seized the estates, the palaces, and the vast accounts. Maria was still wealthy by the standards of a commoner. She had jewels, she had connections, she had the support of the Greek royal family, but the era of limitless spending was over. The mechanism of estrangement had saved her life, but it had not saved her lifestyle. She was forced to downsize, to bargain, to worry about money, mundane humiliations that served as a daily reminder of the catastrophe she had survived. It was in this atmosphere of suspended animation, trapped between a Russian past she hated and an uncertain future, that Maria sought a second escape. If her first escape was geographical, moving to England, her second escape would be emotional. She needed to overwrite the memory of George. She needed to replace the image of the stoic, boring, coin-collecting saint with something vibrant, something alive, something that didn't smell of incense and doom. Enter Pericles Ioannidis. To understand Maria's second marriage, we must view it through the lens of psychological overcompensation. In 1920, shortly after her husband's execution, Maria returned to Greece. It was a return to the air she had always craved. There, she met Pericles. He was an admiral in the Greek Navy. Visually and temperamentally, Pericles was the anti-George. George had been a creature of the indoors, a man of museums, silence, and heavy uniforms. Pericles was a man of the sea. He was sun-weathered, practical, loud, and fundamentally unroyal in the stiff Victorian sense. He did not treat her as a porcelain doll to be worshipped from afar. He treated her as a woman. The romance that developed was rapid, fueled by Maria's desperate need to feel something other than guilt. Psychologists might call this a flight into health, a manic attempt to prove that one is fine, that life goes on, that the trauma has not taken root. For Maria, Pericles represented a return to her pre-Romanov self. He was Greece. He was the sun. He was the chaotic, noisy, vibrant life she had sacrificed on the altar of her first political marriage. But there was a darker undercurrent to this union. By attaching herself to a Greek admiral, Maria was effectively resigning from the Romanov tragedy. She was shedding the skin of the Grand Duchess and trying to become simply Maria. It was an act of erasure. Every moment she spent with Pericles was a moment she didn't have to think about the cell in Petrograd. Every conversation about the Greek Navy was a conversation that wasn't about the Russian Revolution. They married in December 1922 in Wiesbaden, Germany. The location is significant. A spa town, a place of transit, far from the heavy orthodoxy of St. Petersburg or the judgmental eyes of London. The wedding was relatively quiet. There were no gilded carriages, no metropolitans in golden robes. It was a functional union. However, the fatal weakness that had defined Maria's first marriage, her selfishness and need for personal comfort, did not vanish. It merely mutated. In her relationship with George, her selfishness had manifested as distance. In her relationship with Pericles, it manifested as a demanding possessiveness. She clung to him as a lifeline. She had lost her status, her wealth was diminishing, and her first husband was a martyr. Pericles was the only thing she had that felt like a victory. Yet the ghost of George Mikhailovich was a silent third partner in this new marriage. You cannot simply walk away from a man who died loving you. The shadow of his execution lay over Maria's attempts at happiness. We see this in the accounts of her relationship with her daughters, Princess Nina and Princess Xenia. These two young women were the living legacy of George. They carried his blood, his title, and his memory. For Maria, they must have been constant, walking reminders of her betrayal. While she tried to build a new life with Pericles, her daughters were mourning a father they adored, a father who had written them tender letters until the very hour of his death. This created a complex friction. Nina and Xenia were old enough to understand the dynamics. They knew their mother had avoided their father. They knew she was safe while he was dead. And now they watched her marry a man who had no connection to their shared tragedy. The bad wife was now in danger of becoming the bad mother, prioritizing her own romantic salvation over the communal grief of her children. The 1920s and 30s for Maria were a nomadic existence. She moved between London, Rome, and Athens, a high society wanderer. To the outside world, she appeared to be the quintessential survivor, elegant, composed, holding court in hotel lobbies and rented villas. She wrote her memoirs, a Romanov diary, published posthumously. If we analyze these memoirs, we find the final piece of the puzzle of her life-saving estrangement. The book is fascinating not for what it reveals, but for what it conceals. It is a defense attorney's closing argument. In it, she justifies her absences. She speaks of her health, of the political situation, of the necessity of distance. She constructs a narrative where her survival was inevitable, not accidental. But beneath the polished prose, there is a vibrating tension. It is the sound of a woman trying to convince herself. She writes about George with respect, but with a palpable detachment, as if describing a historical figure she once met, rather than the man who fathered her children and died with her name on his lips. This detachment was her final survival mechanism, to let the reality of George's love in, To truly feel the weight of his sacrifice would have destroyed her. So she kept him behind the glass of history, just as he had kept his coins behind glass. As the years ground on, the drama-filled contradictions of her life became more pronounced. She was a Greek princess who became a Russian Grand Duchess, only to flee back to being a Greek wife. Yet she could never scrub the Romanov stain from her soul. She played solitaire in the salons of Europe, a game of isolation, while the world moved toward a second, even more terrible war. Her relationship with Pericles, while offering companionship, could not fix the fundamental brokenness inside her. He was a distraction, not a cure. The cold salvation had worked too well. It had preserved her body, but it had frozen her heart. She had survived the fire of the revolution by staying out in the cold, and she never truly managed to come back into the warmth. But the ripples of her cold salvation did not stop at her own survival. To truly understand the magnitude of the Romanov tragedy, we must look beyond the dead and examine the living, specifically the two daughters, Princess Nina and Princess Xenia, who were the unwitting beneficiaries of their mother's selfishness. If Maria was the architect of the escape, Nina and Xenia were the inhabitants of the life that escape built. They were the physical proof of the life-saving estrangement. Had Maria been a dutiful wife, these two women would almost certainly have perished in the cellar of an execution house in the Urals, or starved in a Bolshevik prison. Instead, they grew up playing tennis in Harrogate, shielded from the bloodbath that consumed their paternal heritage. But survival is a heavy inheritance. Princess Nina, the elder daughter, chose a path that seemed to be a subconscious rejection of the high-stakes royal drama that had killed her father. In 1922, the same year her mother married Pericles, Nina married Prince Paul Chavchavadze. He was a Georgian aristocrat, a man whose family had also lost everything to the revolution. But rather than clinging to the faded grandeur of European courts, they did something radical. They moved to America. Imagine the psychological shift. Nina, a Grand Duchess of Russia by birth, the daughter of a martyr, settled in Wellfleet, Massachusetts, and later Connecticut. She lived a life of artistic bohemia, far removed from the stiff protocols of St. Petersburg or the desperate pretensions of the Parisian exiles. She became an artist. Her husband wrote books. They lived simply. It was as if Nina looked at the fatal weakness of her father, his inability to let go of duty, and decided to run in the opposite direction, toward obscurity and freedom. She survived by becoming invisible to history, by blending into the tapestry of American life. Yet those who knew her spoke of a deep, abiding sadness, a shadow that trailed her even in the bright sunlight of Cape Cod. She was the daughter of the man who stayed, living in the land of the free because her mother had run away. Princess Xenia, the younger daughter, took a more turbulent path, one that collided directly with the greatest mystery of the Romanov aftermath, the case of Anna Anderson. Xenia married William Leeds, the son of an American tin-plate magnate. Suddenly, she had access to the kind of wealth her father had lost. But money could not buy closure. In a fascinating twist of detective history, Xenia became one of the few Romanov relatives to openly support Anna Anderson, the woman who claimed to be the Grand Duchess Anastasia, the youngest daughter of the Tsar. Why would Xenia, safe and wealthy, entangle herself in such a controversial mess? We must look at the psychology of the survivor's guilt. Xenia knew her father had died alone. She knew her cousins, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and Alexei, had been butchered. The idea that one of them might have survived, that one of them might have cheated the Bolsheviks just as she and her mother had, was an intoxicating possibility. It validated the concept of survival against the odds. By supporting Anna Anderson, Zania was perhaps trying to rewrite the ending of the Romanov story, trying to find a miracle in the ashes, to counterbalance the tragedy of her father's solitary death. She even let Anderson stay at her estate in Oyster Bay. It was a desperate attempt to reconnect with the father's side of the family she had lost, a manifestation of the trauma caused by her mother's estrangement. This generational trauma brings us back to the central philosophical question of our narrative, the morality of survival. In the court of history, we often judge women like Maria harshly. We call them frivolous, cold, or disloyal. We contrast them with the stand by your man archetypes, but let us strip away the romanticism and look at the brutal calculus of 1917. If Maria had gone back, what would have been achieved? She would have provided comfort to George for a few years. They would have shared a cell. They would have prayed together. And then she would have been shot. Her daughters would have been shot. The Romanov line through George Mikhailovich would have been extinguished entirely. Her badness, her refusal to submit to a miserable marriage, was the only firewall between her genetic line and total annihilation. Her selfishness was, in a twisted, evolutionary sense, a supreme act of maternal protection. She saved her children by depriving them of a father. It is a paradox that sits like a shard of glass in the heart of this story. The good choice would have led to death. The bad choice led to life. While Maria was building her new life in the Mediterranean sun, history provides us with a terrifying counterpoint. To understand the sheer magnitude of her luck, we must look at the women who made the choice she refused to make. Let us open the dossier on the Romanov wives who stayed. Consider Grand Duchess Elizabeth Feodorovna, Ella. She was Maria's sister-in-law, a woman of renowned beauty and profound, almost saintly piety. When her husband was assassinated in 1905, she didn't flee to the spas of Germany. She sold her jewels, built a convent, and dedicated her life to the poor of Moscow. She was the ultimate good Romanov. She was the embodiment of duty, sacrifice, and spiritual purity. And what was her reward? In July 1918, the Bolsheviks arrested her. They took this nun, this woman who had spent a decade bandaging the wounds of the poor, and drove her into the forests of Alapayevsk. They beat her, threw her alive down a mine shaft, and tossed grenades in after her. She didn't die instantly. Locals heard singing coming from the bottom of the shaft, hymns rising from the darkness until the silence finally won. This contrast is the most violent image in our story. On one side, the saint, broken at the bottom of a mine shaft. On the other, the bad wife, sipping wine in the Mediterranean sun. If Maria had listened to her conscience, if she had succumbed to the pressure of her royal in-laws, she would have been in that mine shaft. Her daughters, Nina and Zania, would have been there with her. The logic of the revolution did not discriminate between the saintly and the selfish. It devoured them all. This forces us to confront a terrifying philosophical conclusion. In the face of totalitarian terror, character is irrelevant, virtue is a liability. The only trait that mattered in 1918 was the willingness to be absent. Maria's superficiality, her dislike of Russia's heaviness, her insistence on her own personal comfort, these were not moral failings in this context. They were evolutionary adaptations. We must also look at the legacy of objects to understand the final tragedy of Grand Duke George Mikhailovich. George was a numismatist. He didn't just collect coins, he curated history. He believed in the preservation of the past. He wrote a definitive corpus on Russian coinage, a work of immense scholarly value. He spent his life gathering these small metal tokens of imperial continuity. He believed that if you cataloged history, you could preserve it. When the revolution came, George's collection, his life's work, was scattered. Some of it was looted. Some was sold by the Bolsheviks to fund their war machine. Some ended up in the Smithsonian. Much of it simply vanished. The physical legacy he tried so hard to build was dismantled piece by piece. But Maria, who didn't care about history, who didn't care about duty, who only cared about the present moment and her own peace of mind, she preserved the only thing that actually matters, the bloodline. George loved dead metal. Maria loved living breath. The metal was lost. The breath survived. There is a supreme irony in the fact that the man who was obsessed with the past was erased by it, while the woman who ignored the past secured the future. It suggests that history belongs not to those who study it or revere it, but to those who know when to run away from it. However, we must not let Maria off the hook too easily. We have spoken of her survival, but we must also speak of her silence. In the years following the execution, the white Russian community in exile was a loud, grieving, raging entity. They published newspapers. They held memorial services. They lobbied governments. Maria's voice in this chorus was notably muted. Why? Because to speak of George was to remind the world that she wasn't there. To crusade for his memory would have invited the question, where were you when he was hungry? Where were you when he was cold? Her silence was a defensive perimeter. She could not champion the martyr without exposing her own desertion. So she let his memory fade. She let him become a footnote. Grand Duke George Mikhailovich is today one of the least known Romanovs. He is not the Tsar. He is not the mystic Rasputin. He is not the tragic Anastasia. He is just a name on a list of victims. And Maria is responsible for that obscurity. A widow is the keeper of her husband's legend. By remarrying quickly, by moving on, by refusing to define herself by her tragedy, she allowed the sands of time to cover George's grave faster than they covered the others. She killed him a second time, not with a bullet, but with indifference. Her health, the very excuse she had used to escape Russia, finally began to fail her. In truth, she died in Athens in December 1940, 64 years old. She had outlived her first husband by 21 years. Maria died as she lived, a woman caught between two worlds belonging fully to neither. In the final accounting, the story of Maria and George breaks the machine of moral karma. George paid the ultimate price for being good. His reward was a bullet in a freezing courtyard. Maria paid no price for being bad. Her reward was a long life in the sun and the survival of her bloodline. This violation of narrative justice is what makes her story so disturbing. It suggests that in the brutal game of survival, the universe does not care about our vows. It cares about our location. George suffered from a fatal attachment to his duty. Maria was blessed with a profound detachment. The heavy sank, the hollow floated. Yet let us not mistake survival for victory. Maria won the game of life, but she lost the game of immortality. George died a hero, his silence filled with meaning. Maria lived a long, comfortable, meaningless life, remembered not for what she did, but for what she didn't do. So the next time you hear a story about a bad wife or a selfish survivor, pause for a moment. Ask yourself, if the executioner was knocking at your door, would you want to be the noble martyr who opens it? Or would you want to be the selfish survivor who is already 10 miles away drinking tea and trying not to look back? Maria made her choice, And because of that choice, her descendants are alive today to tell us that sometimes the coldest heart is the only one that keeps beating.